r/Askreddit by Robotainment. Lawyers of Reddit, what is a detail that your client failed to bring up to you that completely lost you the case? Unfair dismissal case. The client claimed to have been dismissed without reason or following procedure. After we had started the case, it comes out that not only was he given 3 written warnings, but he was also called in for a disciplinary hearing before his dismissal. Don't lie to your lawyer. Similar to a doctor, I feel like not telling your lawyer everything can just hurt you. Not a lawyer yet, but I clerked for a DA's office throughout law school. Obviously we don't have clients, but I'll never forget this kidnapping case I worked on. It involved 2 Asian male defendants who were both the same age and looked relatively similar. Witness is on the stand and is asked to identify where the defendant who pushed a newsie into his face is seated. It's clear the witness is having trouble differentiating the defendants. In a true moment of brilliance, one defendant raises his fucking hand and basically points to himself like, right here bud. Hands down the dumbest shit I'd ever seen. I thought his defense attorney was going to have a brain aneurysm. Who has 2 thumbs and shoved a submachine gun in your face. That he filmed his offenses for his YouTube channel. The cops didn't even know. A witness brought it up on day 3 of a trial. It was a nice quick change of plea that afternoon. What kind of crime was it? It was a typical appointment/interview with the immigration committee in order to grant my client a residence permit. He was marrying a woman in my country with my country's nationality, and this is a legitimate reason to be granted a residence permit. So it was a typical procedure, at least that's what I thought. The committee is bored to death and we all want to be over with it, so they asked him all typical and boring questions, like how did they meet, where they live, etc. They ask these things to identify white/false marriages. At some point they ask him if he was married before, and he says yes, back in my home country, and I'm still married actually, never got a divorce. WTF, I was stunned. Double marriage is forbidden in my country. And he never bothered to mention this detail to me, neither to the other lawyer. When we asked him, he later told me he said the truth because he was afraid to lie in front of a committee. An honest and stupid man. I got all my money though, yet we had to find another way to gain a residence permit. I felt a too real shudder of recognition reading your story. So many times I've asked a client the exact same question like 5 different ways, just to make sure their answer remains consistent. Just to have them answer in the exact opposite way before the judge or decision maker during the hearing. Like, fuck, why even retain me if you're not even going to stick to the plan you're paying me money for? One of the unsolved mysteries of life, eternally. I'm actually a lawyer, but I was only watching this trial, not participating. So the case was that woman A had hit woman B in the head with a heavy beer pint at a bar, and woman B got pretty serious injuries. The defense claimed that woman A had not hit anyone with the pint, but instead had just thrown the pint into a random direction, and it happened to hit B in the head. Thus it was an accident, and not a battery. Well, the prosecution had a CCTV tape from the bar, and it was shown at the trial, and the tape clearly showed in HD as A walked behind B and smashed the pint to her head so hard that the pint shattered on impact. I looked at the defense lawyer and his jaw literally almost hit the table. The prosecutor also noticed this and asked something along thrown A. And the defense lawyer said that due to technical difficulties he couldn't get the CCTV tape open on his computer when he was reviewing the evidence. Woman A was found guilty, so yeah, I was completely dumbfounded. I can't get the file to play. What is it? Video of the incident? Oh, it'll show you didn't do it, right? Oh, yeah, great. Next file please. Lost due to the incompetence of the lawyer, not at client's fault. I mean, the client was also at fault here. Client in family law matter lied to me about using meth. Then used meth with the child in the room, and the ex got footage of it on the nanny cam, and then made excuses about why they couldn't do a drug test, then blamed me when they lost custody, despite the fact that they didn't show up to appointments or return my calls, so I couldn't prepare any court material. I dumped the client after that and left family law. What kind of law do you do now? I'm a public defender in an area with lots of meth use. Meth makes most people talk a lot. So I can't tell you how many clients forget to mention that they got to the jail still high and called their mom/girlfriend/buddy on the recorded jail phone and not only confessed to the crime but also brainstormed whatever alibi or version of events I'm relying on to defend them. Edit. I'm seeing this question a lot, so I'll add some info here. This is not legal advice, just explaining things a bit more. Calls to a lawyer are privileged and generally go through dedicated lines that aren't recorded, depending on the facility. Calls to family, friends, etc. through the normal phones are not privileged, are generally recorded, and can be used in court. There are usually printed signs near the phones and a recorded warning before each call that this is the case. I was in court once for a school journalism project, and there was a woman in court who had been arrested for weed and crack possession when she came to bail out her boyfriend from a separate arrest. Apparently he called her from jail and told her to come bail her out and to bring some weed and crack. The guard overheard him, and it was recorded on the jail phone, so they arrested her when she showed up. Employment law matter. He claimed to have been unfairly dismissed over bogus performance management. The real reason, he organized via Craigslist to have someone collect a box of his cum from a children's playground. There were explicit messages from him asking what they did with it and whether they rubbed it all over themselves. The employer provided us the messages. Edit. He was doing this on company time. FDA dismissed a guy for insider trading. He would access a database of drugs about to be approved, which nearly always caused stock to go up. He'd made millions buying stock in his family's name to cover his tracks. But he made a fatal mistake. He looked at the database and then bought stock with his work computer, which FDA owned, and could search without consent. You click a statement to that effect each time you sign on. If he'd waited and done it on his own computer, they'd have had to get a search warrant, a much tougher proposition. www.washingtonpost.com link. Case as a paralegal, negligence case. Client argued that a lack of street lights and a cyclist he couldn't see was responsible for him hitting a wire pole. Upon discovery, the first respondent's report indicated that they found the driver in the driver's seat, pants down, with porn playing on the phone. Wasn't difficult to figure out who was negligent at that point. Your Honor, if the cable repairman had simply fixed the cable in accordance with professional standard practices, my client would have had no other recourse but to keep his ostrich in the corral on the evening in question. I'm a court-appointed attorney for qualifying individuals in family matters. Termination of parental rights case. Have been fighting to argue that parent is stable, working lawfully, has a suitable apartment, doesn't need psychotropic meds anymore, ready to be a parent, etc. After a few months of negotiating with all the parties and Department of Children, Court Services, we have a pre-trial to try and convince guardians. I meet with my client before the hearing to see if anything changed. Nope, all good, let's get my kids. Great, that's not happening today, but let's try. We get going in court. My client, who is super hot-headed and quick to anger, gets riled up and goes off on the guardians, screaming in open court. It doesn't end there, but reveals 1. That no longer is working. 2. No longer in apartment. 3. Doesn't want to have a relationship with guardians despite her kids loving them. 4. Won't send her kids pictures of the toys they miss and can't have. 5. Plans on moving out of state. 6. Thinks they can live as a family off of state aid when she gets them back and is 4 months pregnant. All in the matter of 15 seconds. I was too shocked to even react. Speechless. Not the image of stability and parental fitness I've been trying to paint since last July. Edit to clarify. Client was working really hard to get everything right and legitimately had everything going for her prior to this hearing. I was not making false representations or trying to get a monster reinstated. This was a true bombshell as I did my due diligence to make sure things were on the up and up and statutory requirements were met. Things fell apart very fast apparently. This was a very atypical situation. Parents typically do a really good job working hard to meet their requirements. We became a foster family about a year ago. We've had several short-term placements since then, and I always go to the hearings because that's when you can truly find out what's going on. Kid is put into care with all kinds of injuries that parent can't explain, but they all seem to happen when they're at work and the kid is left at home with family. It was very clear that the kiddo was being abused and neglected during these times, and their romantic partner was the only one there when these injuries were happening. Parent comes to court and lets us know that they've broken up with that person and we can give them their kid back now. Judge asks when they broke up and parent replies, just now before we walked in, so I can get my kid back. Abusive person sitting next to them, drove them there, still living together, etc. Judge wasn't buying it. Not my client, but the son of the opposing party, and presumably the party himself lied about being blind to make himself seem more sympathetic as a witness. We didn't know either until he took the witness box. Their counsel asked him to take the oath, and he picked the card up and read it. That was the cherry on top of a series of ridiculous events. The judge dismissed the whole thing in our client's favor shortly after. I was a trainee at the time, but my boss, who was in her late 60s then, said it was the most ridiculous case she'd ever handled. And he picked the card up and read it. I was expecting he easily walked up or sat down, not that he was stupid enough to actually read something out. Had a woman with an expensive fur coat and she claimed that the laundry ruined it. It was kinda ruined, but the laundry claimed those stains were already there. Judge ordered an expert opinion lab and the fur coat had traces of cocaine and other illegal drugs all over it. There was a raid at her place then, and her husband got convicted because they found several kilograms of drugs. I was involved in a hit and run car accident. My leg was pretty mangled. However, the driver of the car was caught. Turns out he was a rich kid who was driving his mum's convertible Porsche. Denied all knowledge of hitting me etc. At the trial, the prosecutor asked him how long he had been driving, to which he answered, "Do you mean how long have I been driving legally or illegally?" The judge then went nuts asking why and when he had been driving illegally. His defense team sat down in their chairs and shook their heads. Needless to say, he lost the case. Interestingly, he died a year later by drowning. He had hired speedboat and holiday, flipped it over and drowned. Turns out he was drunk at the time. Karma can be a cunt. I can picture how the kid thinks he's tough by saying the exact same things to his friends, and that reply just become a habit to him anytime anyone asked about him driving. Not a lawyer. My parents had a long messy divorce that took 2.5 years in court. My dad claimed that my mother was trying to take 100% of everything based on a settlement offer she sent him. He failed to mention to his lawyers that her initial offer also sent to his previous lawyers was a 60/40 split, and she only sent that 100% one in response to an equally unreasonable offer from him. As soon as she could prove the initial offer was reasonable, the judge just basically ruled on everything according to that first offer. His lawyers were so angry because they built their entire case around the idea that she was the unreasonable one. I think it was something to do with arguing that she was not sending genuine settlement offers. I'm not sure why. His goal wasn't to win, it was to prolong the battle. But the original offer exposed him in the lie in front of the judge, which made the rest of the process go very quickly. This literally sounds like my dad. My mum's lawyer used to tell her that the rulings from our case were some of the most unfair rulings on his side ever. He was paying child support, decided it was too much, got some external agency to re-evaluate. Turns out he was paying too little. Thanks for showing me that there are more crazy dads out there. Edit. Thanks to everyone for sharing their stories. It's nice to know you're not the only one with a batshit crazy parent. Not me, but my mentor. This is the reason you never ask questions that you don't already know the answer to in court. During the trial with the judge on a divorce matter, the wife brought up that he had abused her during the course of their marriage. Client whispers to my mentor that is absolutely not true. On the stand, during his portion of testimony, my mentor asks, at any point in the marriage, did you lay your hands on your wife? One time we were having an argument, and I held her down on the couch until she stopped arguing with me. What? My mentor said it was like she could see it happening in slow motion and all the alarm bells were going off in her head because he had never mentioned this, and, apparently, to him, this was not abuse. The judge gave wife a lot more money as a result and husband was baffled. My mentor was fuming. Husband admitted this was the only time he had laid hands on wife. My mentor was more peeved because she had thought the case was in the bag. since wife had abandoned the kids with husband to run off with her lover down in Florida and literally only came back to the state to get the divorce done. Husband had been noted as being a great dad to the kids and a good figure in the community, hence why she was so damn shocked at his answer. Not a lawyer, but a woman I know received several hefty speeding fines. In my country you can go see a magistrate to have the fines reduced if you plead poverty. She heard about this and decided to give it a shot, so she went to court and told the magistrate a sob story about not having enough money. The magistrate heard her out. Then he asked her, "Madam, what type of car do you drive?" She replied in a tiny voice, "A Porsche." Edit. Many have raised the fair point that a Porsche doesn't necessarily cost that much and isn't indicative of her financial status. So I'll add that it was not a beat up or old model at the time. She could have paid the fines without breaking the bank. She was just pushing her luck. She's a wealthy woman who just didn't want to pay her fines and the magistrate wasn't having any of it. Reminds me of an article I read a few years back about a family who was fairly well off. Then the recession hit and they lost their jobs, their house, and sold most of their material goods. One of the things they kept was their paid off luxury car because it made more sense to keep it as a reliable vehicle compared to whatever they could do with the money selling it would have netted, since even luxury cars depreciate fast and hard compared to other assets. Probably not the case here, but it did give me something to think about. Not me, but my dad represented a guy in a civil case. He doesn't normally do criminal law, but in this instance the question of a forged signature came up, and his client lied, saying he didn't forge it. My dad was very clear in explaining that admitting to him wouldn't land him in jail, it would just allow him to build a better defense, but he still denied forgery, and so my dad rolled with it. He said his case was completely cut up once it came out that yes, in fact, his client did forge the signature, and #X200B. Guys and gals, your lawyers aren't a snitch, they're trying to get you the best possible result. Always be honest to your lawyer. Guy in prison hired me to request a modification of his sentence because he was doing very well, completing a lot of optional programs, no rule violations, etc. He had his family come in and pay and everything to get started. I asked the family and the client if he had requested modification before, because the law said that for his conviction, he could only request modification twice for any one sentence, regardless of if they were granted or denied. Swore up and down he'd never filed before. You can see where this is going. After spending a few hours going over records and preparing documents, a copy of the CCS, the case record, basically finally arrived. He'd personally filed for modification 6 times, since he was sentenced with handwritten pleadings that were all denied. So the one he hired me for was a waste of time and would never be considered at all. Now you put it that way, maybe I did hit the car. Simple is good. I was actually on a jury. Guy was suing a business, said he got injured, couldn't work for 3 years. Defense counsel: "Sir, isn't it true that you spent 18 of those months in prison for armed robbery?" Edit for more info. Guy was saying he was shopping at a major grocery store chain and slipped in some water on the ground in front of a freezer. Guy has cell phone video his wife made of him in the water, and we could hear her saying that the water wasn't showing up on video and to splash it with his hand so it would look better in the video. It also came out that he'd had 3 prior convictions for crimes of dishonesty. That may not be the exact term, but something similar, for things like shoplifting and other petty crimes. Second edit for more info while I'm on my lunch break. Guy was representing himself pro se. Defense counsel asked him if his inability to work could be from the 2 previous knee injuries he'd had. When asked how they knew about those injuries, he was told his previous lawyer had given the defense's medical records upon request. Guy wanted to enter his MRIs as evidence, but had no one there as an expert witness to explain to the jury what they showed. He wanted to show us what the results were. Not mine, but saw it in r/entitled prints. The case was about a woman who took the car from her daughter and grounded her. The daughter called the police and the court proceedings began. Apparently the woman didn't tell her lawyer that the daughter was 22 years old and didn't live with her mom. The mom decided to go to the daughter's place and took her car out without her knowledge. Lawyer in the UK. I acted for a member of a famous pedophile hunting group. My client was charged with various offenses relating to his vigilantism, most seriously, causing grievous bodily harm with intent. He wanted me to fight the case on a public interest offense point that is not available to him in statute, or at common law contrary to my advice. I followed his instructions as I'm bound to do. If the state won't punish pedophiles properly, then it's left to men like my client to take the law into their own hands. A horseshit argument for a whole host of reasons. His laptop was seized by police and submitted for forensic examination. He had a staggeringly huge database of child pornography on it. He himself was a massive pedo. Edit. Spelling. Edit 2. Spelling again. There can be only one. My father is a judge. I remember him talking about a case where a woman was suing for a severe back injury that she said was preventing her from working and taking care of her kids and so on. In the middle of the trial, a pen rolled off the table and she is bending over trying to reach it from her chair, but pen was too far away, so she stands up and bends over and picks it up and goes back to her seat as if nothing is out of the ordinary. My dad is just looking at her and she snaps at my dad and goes, "What are you staring at?" My dad asked her if she was okay, and her response was that she was fine. Her attorney leaned over and said something to her, and she then loudly started complaining about her back and how much her back hurt, but no one believed her. Lol. I was approached by this attorney to work for him for free to go after smugglers. This guy had been arrested for dumping goods onto American markets that violated trade agreements. In his arrest, a bunch of goods were left in warehouses to rot, and their owners, his clients, were never paid. This attorney showed me that this smuggler had assets, and that he had gone to the criminal trial and gotten the judge to set aside $2 million of the criminal penalties to settle his client's debts. He had receipts, invoices, all of the paperwork. He just needed associates to help him take the case to trial. He wanted me to work for free, but he would pay me on contingency once he obtained the verdict. He had 2 other attorneys working for him with the same deal. I worked on the case for a short while, but luckily moved on to other things. The other 2 attorneys worked on that case for over 2 years. At one point, they negotiated a $1.5 million settlement of all claims. The attorney in charge rejected the offer because he was convinced he could get twice as much at trial. In the end, the case settled for $200K because none of the clients would enter the United States to testify for fear of being arrested. The 2 associates got $8K apiece for 2 years of work. At one point, they negotiated a $1.5 million settlement of all claims. The attorney in charge rejected the offer because he was convinced he could get twice as much at trial. In the end, the case settled for $200K because none of the clients would enter the United States to testify for fear of being arrested. The 2 associates got $8K apiece for 2 years of work. If the attorney in charge accepted the $1.5 million settlement, would they get $60K apiece for 2 years of work? Would that be something they would be satisfied with? I have no idea how much would associates reasonably expect. Not mine, but went to court over a ticket. Lady was in front of me for DUI and hit and run. The judge assigns a lawyer for her since she was so shook she quit her job. The judge asked the prosecuting attorney for details on the case. She legit says, "You mean that car I hit while I was intoxicated?" The judge stops, takes his glasses off, and says, "Everything is recorded in this courtroom. I told you not to talk to anyone about your case, except the attorney that I assigned for you." You could tell he was ready to walk out of the room with the level of stupidity this lady showed. Sounds like my mom points going through a lawsuit with her hoa, and in her head she just thinks that she can just explain everything away and everyone will be on her side. Points met with her lawyer twice already and he keeps telling her stick to facts only, and her response is always, "Well, I have to explain this," or "But this is what I think and feel." If she ever gets arrested, she will never remain silent. I had to go to court for child support and she wrote a 3-page letter to the judge about why my ex was garbage and fully expected me to get up in court and read it. I had a prosecutor representing the enforcement agency that did all the talking. He'd sent a photo of his wife's beaten face to his wife with a message saying something along the lines of this, "Do you want this to happen again?" He came across very well in court up to that point, but his mask slipped when that came out. When I was an intern at court, I was watching a battery trial with another intern. The defendant was asked if he can remember how many people were present when he beat up the other guy. He then points at my fellow intern and says rather loudly, "She was there, but she didn't see anything. Don't trust her." Of course she wasn't there, and the defendant was found guilty. I wasn't a lawyer in this role, but was a law clerk. This was a typical divorce case. This particular jury trial was about splitting assets and who would get what. It was a long drawn out case that took about 5 days. Right before the closing arguments, the attorneys wanted to talk to the judge. It seems as though a couple of days prior the couple decided to get back together, and instead of telling the judge and their lawyers, they just kept it a secret. We heard 4 days of evidence, arguments, brought in experts such as land assessors, financial planning people and the like, and they were back together. One of the attorneys asked to be dismissed from the case immediately and walked out the courtroom. The judge had to dismiss the jury, and the couple was adamant that they didn't think that them getting back together was a detail any of their attorneys needed to know. Edit. Yes, in some states there are jury trials for divorces. However, this particular case wasn't for the divorce, but for a cause of action stemming from the divorce marital property. It was a jury trial. I typed a whole story out and then realized it was super boring. So, my poorly condensed TL doctor version, we were seeking, among other things, a freezing order over $30 million assets that were at risk of being dissipated. There was a foreign judgment for debt that we needed to have recognized and enforced. Our client was a well-reputed foreign lawyer who insisted the appeal period for that foreign judgment had long passed, and it was therefore imperative that we make all these applications now. Instead of properly doing our own independent research, we relied on our client's word regarding the appeal period. In reality, there were 2 appeal periods, and while the first had indeed passed, the second was still outstanding, meaning we could not seek to have a foreign judgment recognized and enforced just yet per our own court rules. We did actually realize the error before we went to a hearing due to an associate on our team having a hunch something was off, and another associate actually being able to read procedural rules in the relevant foreign language. But we did have to adjourn the hearing and entirely redo many of our pleadings and affidavits, during which time the defendant did indeed dump a bunch of his assets, leaving us with a mostly dry judgment. I need a TLDR for the TLDR. Didn't lose the case, but caused the judge to lose his shit, and for the whole pre-trial to be tossed and restarted from scratch. Was in the jury pool waiting for the jury to be picked when we had a fire alarm go off and we all went outside. Apparently one of the jurors talked to the defendant accidentally because of confusion on leaving the building, came back next day and started the whole process over again when suddenly a sidebar is called. Turns out the defendant mentioned to his lawyer the guy who was added to the jury at that point was the one he talked to outside during the fire alarm. Judge flips his shit on both the fact the juror talked to the defendant during the mess and that they didn't just dismiss us outright that day when the fire alarm happened, since we had not actually started picking anyone due to the fire alarm. After ranting and raving and watching buckets of spit leave the judge's mouth and hit both lawyers, he comes back, calmly apologizes to all of us, and tells us we are dismissed. Outside of that, one of the times I was on the pool, I watched a defendant realize how fucking real it now was and change his plea during jury selection. That also pissed the judge off to no end. A buddy of mine case as a public defender. A gal was busted on drug charges and told him she didn't have any drugs on her when they arrested her. He thought, okay, we'll use that. Turns out, she didn't have any drugs on her when they arrested her because she just sold them to an undercover cop. He did pay the Haitian men to beat him up. I moved to dismiss the case based on the fact that they are Nigerian and not Haitian. Also, I countersue for $1 gazillion wacko bucks because of reasons. Not strictly a court case, but boneheaded stupidity. A number of people have given a false name to police to avoid an arrest warrant, but got arrested when the false name matched someone with an outstanding arrest warrant. Lowering Thibet.net link. There's a rule you're supposed to follow when questioning trial witnesses, and that rule is to never ask a question you don't know the answer to. Despite this rule, lawyers often ask small, apparently inconsequential questions which are necessary to set the scene, but are so inconsequential or obvious that their answers are fairly presumed. This case was an exception to that general presumption. The defendant was arrested on a warrant and transported to jail. After booking him into jail, the officer returned to his vehicle and discovered a baggie of drugs sitting right in the middle of the backseat. The defendant was charged with possession. At trial, the officer explained that he routinely searches his vehicle before his shift starts and after any time he transports someone in the backseat. The defense attorney tried to poke holes in the story, but the officer's testimony was remarkably consistent. The officer was fastidious about checking his vehicle. The appearance of the drugs coincided with the defendant's presence in the vehicle. Then, as the defense attorney was running out of questions, he threw out the question, "Was there anyone else in the backseat of the vehicle?" It was a Hail Mary. Even when there are multiple arrests, police tend not to transport more than one arrestee at a time, if they can help it. There was no reason to believe anyone else could have feasibly been in the backseat with the defendant, though it's no surprise to you. The defense attorney and prosecutor were stunned when the answer came back as yes. Turns out, the defendant was with his girlfriend when he was arrested, and the officer courteously agreed to drive her to her apartment before taking her boyfriend to jail. This fact was not included in the police report. The officer never told the prosecutor, and, shockingly, the defendant never told his attorney. There was a palpable pause as this fact sunk in. Since there was another person in the back seat, there was more than enough reasonable doubt. Proofs were concluded, and the prosecutor threw out a half-hearted closing. The not guilty verdict was a given. Because of this case, I'll learn to never assume a fact, no matter how obvious it may seem. Had a client charged with reckless driving for going 200 miles an hour with his pregnant girlfriend in the car. Dude showed up to court with a shirt that had a huge logo of Acme Racing on it. It was years ago, and I can't remember the actual name of the racing team. Another client showed up in court very nicely dressed, and had even ironed his jeans, but the jeans had giant marijuana leaves all down the front. At least he wasn't there for a drug case. Over my summer internship, I helped with trying to get some evidence admitted. The evidence was recorded audio of mental abuse over the phone, daughter talking to father. Lawyer spent a while trying to show there was no expectation of privacy for the conversation. Client went on stand, and the first thing she said regarding the audio tape was that she always stays as far away from her daughter and lets the daughter lock her bedroom door so that their conversation has the utmost privacy. It wasn't admitted, lol. Minor traffic cases can be the worst for this, believe it or not, because they are short and simple and oftentimes the client isn't there. So if you get blindsided by something critical, there's often no chance to consult with them to turn things around. I had a simple speeding case, 70 miles per hour in a 55. No big deal. If she does a driving improvement course, they court will usually dismiss or reduce those, since her driving record wasn't bad. When I showed up for her, I found out that she had been driving 70 up an unplowed snow lane to get around all the other cars traveling in the lane that had been plowed because they were driving too slow. I didn't know it was even possible to drive 70 on fresh snow. The officer stated he'd already cut her a break by not writing the ticket for reckless driving, and the judge politely agreed he didn't feel comfortable reducing it under those circumstances. When I called her up after court to confirm, she claimed she'd just forgotten to mention it. Now maybe I've lived too much of my life in the South, but that just boggles my mind as a detail you'd forget when hiring a lawyer for that incident. I would have told her in advance that hiring us was a waste of money, not to mention the hassle of taking an 8-hour class, and she should probably just go ahead and pay this one. I legitimately do that all the time during consults, give my honest assessment if the case is even worth doing, and so by omitting that detail she harmed herself for no reason. At least she took it well and didn't get defensive. Something opposite but worth telling. Years ago, I assisted an attorney whose client was caught in a drug sting operation. After meticulous review of the discovery info received, the officer who typed the arrest report failed to include that defendant who was charged with possession of controlled substance ever had possession of controlled substance. Guy was out that same day for time already served. Years ago, I had a client charged with drunk in public. It's a minor infraction, but he was on probation, so he needed to fight it. He told me he was very drunk that night, but had made it to the lobby of his brother's apartment and was waiting for him to come down to get him upstairs. I take this information and run with it, bringing photos of the apartment complex and the bylaws to court. My goal was to prove that the lobby of the apartment was secured to guests and residents only, which would arguably take the drunkenness out of being in public. There is no formal discovery for minor infractions in my state, since there isn't a real option for a plea deal on the minor charge, and wanting to ambush the officer with my argument, I do not discuss the case with him, and we go to trial. The wheels came off the wagon when the officer testified that he encountered my client at an apartment building on the other side of the city. He was outside at the call box, not even in the lobby of this different building, rambling AMD, barely able to stand. I'm whispering to my client about this reversal, and he slumps over and says something to the effect of, "Sorry, I meant to go to my brother's apartment." Maybe that's why he couldn't find me, and he sounded angry on that phone. Cross-examination was not fruitful. It was basically, "Officer, are you really sure it happened where you said it did, and not at this other apartment building miles away?" Closing argument that he wasn't that drunk also didn't get us anywhere. In the end, there was a fast guilty finding, a minor fine, wasted ink and paper from printing useless exhibits, and light sanctions later on the probation violation. This is not my story, but it happened while I was in court waiting to be heard on a different matter. A man in his 70s had sued his wife 50s due to physical abuse. Apparently she had thrown hot water at him, and he had burnt scars on his chest and hand. The wife claimed that it was a fight where both parties were to blame, and he had hit her first. The judge asked him if he had indeed hit her first. Not wanting to incriminate himself, the man answered, "It is possible." Cue the whole courtroom having a good laugh. They were sent to couples counseling, but they definitely seemed like an interesting couple. I heard of a guy trying to appeal his disability benefit being revoked. He was supposedly a paraplegic, but the opposition had over 10 minutes of video footage of him walking, running and even jumping over a fence. After the 1-minute mark, the judge said, "Okay, I've seen enough. Please leave." In a quiet title case, where the purchaser of a piece of real property was seeking an implied easement by necessity, the client failed to mention that, when he purchased the real property in the late 1950s, the conveyance was done to a defunct corporation. This is critical, because a defunct corporation does not have the legal capacity to act, and, consequently, the conveyance was void. I checked the Secretary of State website, but the records did not go back that far. I took him at his word that the corporation was active at the time of the conveyance. It is unclear to me why he chose to have the property conveyed to his defunct corporation, rather than taking ownership as an individual, but it was a fatal mistake to the case. As a non-legal person, I have an opposite kinda case. A friend of mine leased a house in his name and moved in with 2 other friends. Everything is cool, it's a real party house. After about 6 months he has met a girl and he decides to move in with her. When he moved out he didn't change the lease and the other guys assured him they would pay the rent and look after the house. But one by one they leave, and then all the new occupants have no ties to my friend, who has the lease. At some point they stop paying rent and the agent calls and tells them they will be evicted. So they have a huge fucking party and trash the place totally. My friend calls me and asks if I will help him clean up his old place as the agent has rung him. I agree and meet him at his old house. I had some plaster repair stuff, paint, and things to get a rental through an inspection. Well, we walked through the house and the damage was total. I mean, there were no cupboards in the kitchen. What was left of them was on a fire out the back. Every door was busted off its hinges. Every room had holes you could walk through in the walls. There was no way to repair this house without gutting and rebuilding the whole inside, not to mention the damage to the gardens. We wandered through the house in shock. It was fucked, and so was my friend. My friend went and spoke with his dad, who has a friend who is a lawyer, who asks for a copy of the lease. We go to the agent and ask for a copy of the lease. They tell us that the damage bill is about half the value of the house. They photocopy the lease and then give us a copy of the ID that he used when signing the lease. Proves friend leased the place, his driver's license. We go to lawyer who looks things over and then looks at the ID, laughs and says you were only 17 when you signed this. You can't sign a legal document unless you are 18 or older. We go back to agent and point this out. They lose their shit, but they can't do anything. They even had to give the bond back because they were not legally allowed to take it in the first place. TLDR friend signs lease for rental. House when 17 it gets trashed totally. Agent wants money. Friend wasn't legally allowed to sign for lease. Not responsible. Should have charged the friends for arson and vandalism. Edit. My bad. Should have charged the new occupants. Not a lawyer, but a manager in an unfair dismissal case. One of the shift supervisors caught a call center worker making private phone calls during his shift. All employees sign an agreement that they are not to use office phones for personal calls. She told me what she had heard, and we checked the phone records and found he had made over a dozen calls to the same number in the previous week. It was very clear that they were private calls because they were calls to a gay sex line. Now, the specific number he was calling was totally irrelevant as far as I was concerned, but given the potentially sensitive nature of the calls, I decided that it would be best to call him into the office with witnesses, discuss what we had found, and issue him with an official warning. I typed up the warning and had it printed out and ready to go. When he came into the office with his chosen witness, I asked him if he was aware of the company's policy on private calls, and he said yes. I showed him the phone number he'd been caught dialing and asked him if he recognized it and if he had called it from the office phones. He immediately lost his shit, started yelling, and kicked his chair against the wall before shouting at everyone that he quit and storming out through the call center, hurling profanities left and right at the top of his lungs. I let my manager in the our department know what had happened and got statements from everyone involved including his witness. 2 days later, he turns up at the office with his solicitor, demanding an immediate meeting with the general manager. His solicitor wanted a big compensation payout, demanded that I be immediately fired, and suggested that he was going to pursue criminal charges against me personally for hate crimes because his client said that I had fired him for being gay. The general manager called me into the meeting and asked me to give my side of the story. I showed the solicitor the signed agreement regarding the private calls policy, the call records which showed all of the calls he had made during his shifts, and the warning I had typed and printed for making personal calls. I pointed out that at no point had the fact that the calls had been to a sex line been the issue, and that his sexuality had nothing at all to do with what had happened. I then pointed out that I had signed statements from 3 witnesses that his client had quit and not actually been fired, and reminded him again that the company was only going to give him a warning in the first place and had no intention of firing him at all. The solicitor took 2 or 3 deep breaths, apologized to the GM and myself for wasting our time, and specifically to me for the threats of legal action which were not justified in light of the actual evidence, and walked out, literally pulling the client behind him. The cherry on top? 2 weeks later I got a call from another call center I'd worked at previously, looking for a reference for him. Little late to the party, but here goes, and obligatory. Not my client. Company I worked for at the time was doing due diligence before acquiring a small tech startup. The COO of the tech startup was a well-liked guy in the company, friendly and outgoing, though we had heard rumblings that the COO was rather hands-on with the work and with female employees. Apparently there was a walk-away package proposed to the COO that would let him keep a sizable portion of his post-acquisition bonus because a young woman who worked in their sales department had filed our complaints against the COO and obtained counsel. I sat in on the meeting with the COO and the company's retained lawyers while they grilled him about his contacts with the young woman. The COO denied ever having contact with her within the company without multiple other people present. Those people said his behavior toward her in the meetings didn't raise any flags. The COO emphatically denied having any contact with her outside of work. The lawyers asked the question a half dozen different ways, and each time the COO denied any out of work contact. Later we meet with the woman and her lawyer with the COO not present. Her lawyer gives us a rather graphic card that came with a bouquet of flowers addressed to her from the COO. The guy had an account with a florist linked to his credit card. When the company retained lawyers confronted him, he said, "But I never had contact with her. It's not like I delivered the flowers myself." COO got terminated for cause so no walkaway package. At her request the woman was given PTO until after the acquisition, then moved to another one of the companies under our umbrella. I have a story for this. I was in trial for domestic violence charges from my wife, now ex, where she claimed I had thrown white paint on my own car and proceeded to beat her up. What really happened was that we were arguing. She was destroying my things and throwing them out the window. I told her I was done, and so she decided to throw rocks at my car, tried to pick up a rock the size of my head to smash through the windshield, and when that proved too heavy she grabbed a 1-gallon paint can to throw at my car. As she tried to throw the paint can at my car, I stopped her and tossed the can aside, at which point she tried to attack me with an ice scraper. At this point I restrained her and sat on top of her until she calmed down. She did. I let her go. She ran to the busted open paint can, scooped up paint with her hands, and threw it at my car. She then went back in the house. I went to the front door to ask for my things so I can get the hell out of there. She tried to kick me in the balls, but I caught her foot and held it, telling her to fucking chill. She tugged to get her foot back and ended up hitting her foot on the door frame, which caused a slight cut and bruise. Well, I left and she called the cops saying I was beating her up and such. We go to trial. I defend myself and she tells her story of the battered wife, that I was beating her up, threw paint at my own car, and that I slammed her foot in the door frame. At the trial, my lawyer pulls out the pictures of my black car covered in white paint and asks if I really threw paint at my own car. She of course says yes, but then my lawyer pulled out pictures the police station took of her to document her injuries. They were front and side views of her, but you can tell her hands were covered in white paint like gloves. Plus, it came out that she was cheating, which was the original reason we were arguing in the first place. The jury acquitted me, and it was funny that I met the jury foreperson in the elevator as I was leaving the courthouse. She told me, "We decided to let you go because you need a divorce. We decided to let you go because you need a divorce." Well, that's kinda scary. Not that you were innocent. Fucking A. That he was determined to keep answering the judge's questions in a poor way and not letting me speak once. This was a case against the municipality which denied his request to build a roof terrace. He exclaimed, "Computer says no," 3 times when the representative of the municipality brought up zoning plans etc. to back up their argument to turn his request down. He was quite excited afterwards and thought it went pretty good. He lost convincingly. Oh, by the way, this guy was a lawyer himself. That he had a warrant out for him in another state for jumping bail under a known alias, that he was going to wear the same clothes to court that he committed the crime in, and driving a stolen car with a screwdriver as a key when he didn't even have a license to court, and was drinking whiskey, taking opioids illegally, and smoking weed illegally in that car right before court. He had been trying to claim it was someone that looked like him that committed the crime, and that he didn't do drugs, drive, drink, or have any criminal history at all. Those things he did before court, along with calling the judge Your Majesty and calling the arresting detective Osifer instead of officer in court, invoking the 5th commandment instead of amendment, and being on camera both at the scene of the crime and on security cam outside the courthouse in the same damn clothes, while getting wasted before his hearing kinda sealed the deal against him. Was your client Dave Chappelle? Him telling my car mates the story while we sit in traffic, pleading the 5th commandment just killed all of us, call an ambulance. I had a client who, despite being a large man, had been domestically abused by his much smaller wife throughout their marriage. After the divorce she turned her anger on their son. He ran away one day to live with his dad, and we filed to restrict her parenting time and for a permanent modification. At the permanent hearing she denied being abusive to the child or my client in front of the child, said she never threatened anyone ever, and that she never made disparaging remarks about my client in front of their son. What she didn't know, and therefore hadn't told her attorney, is that he had recorded multiple instances of her abuse. So I called my client back up for rebuttal and played an audio recording of her screaming at my client, threatening to break his face in, and calling him a loser, all while the child could be heard in the background begging her to stop. I looked over at the other attorney, and she had her face in her hands. We won. Had a work comp case where a client claimed he fell off the side of his truck while putting a tarp over the load and hurt his back. It seemed legit as he was taken to a hospital and they had given him meds. As we were pursuing the case, it turns out the company had a surveillance camera. The injury seemed fishy to the employer, so they looked at the recording. It turns out the idiot had climbed off the side of the truck, then laid down on the ground and started yelling for help. He had made the whole thing up. No wonder employers question work comp injuries. This guy ruined it for the legitimate claims. Not telling us they didn't sign a contractual document the whole case rested on, then not telling us the contract they did provide us with that the case was based upon was obsolete due to the new contract. Basically a shitload of employees passing the buck on the blame for a massive systemic fuck up. Edit. We found out during discovery. Fun. Client was injured when he slipped on ice in the common parking lot of his multi-family house. Turns out he was the one responsible for clearing the lot. Thanks buddy. Arnold. I was in a visitation/child support case with my ex over our 3-year-old. We had both moved on and gotten remarried. Our visitation order was for him to pick up our child from my house at 6 p.m. on every other Friday night. He frequently would show up at 9 p.m. or later, with no call ahead of time, to let us know what was going on, or even show up the next day, when he felt like it, and expect us to not only be there, but to be waiting on him. This was before cell phones were popular, but both he and I had one, so he had a means of contacting us. After one too many incidences, my husband and I set up our video camera. Yes, I know, but this was over 20 years ago. We placed it where it would record our TV, so they could see the evening news for a timestamp, our home phone to prove we weren't caught, and our driveway to prove he never showed when he was supposed to. After 6 months or so of this, we head to court. He told his lawyer that he was there on time every visit, and we just wouldn't allow him to see his son. The judge asked us to go to a private room with our lawyers to see if we could work things out. Once there, the other lawyer M jumps on my lawyer F, who was 8 MOs pregnant with twins, about how her clients were lying and we were scum, etc. She calmly leaned over, picked up the first bag out of about 5, and laid it on the table. She explained that it was full of tapes from the visitations he never showed for, and said that all the bags had the same. She then asked if he would like for the judge to come in and watch the tapes with us. He asked us to leave so he could confer with my ex. He conferred so loudly the judge had to send someone in to quiet them down. Needless to say, we got everything we asked for. I was very fair. 1. Clients lie all the time. Point 2. Client lies will always be uncovered in relatively early stages of discovery if the lawyers on both sides are doing their jobs at all. I had a client defraud me into taking her case and waste months of my time, only for me to discover that she was lying about everything once the opposing side asked for a bunch of discovery and she refused to provide it and started ducking my calls and making excuses. Client said his ex owed him a lot of money and that she was trying to get out of paying him back by getting a protective order against him. Seemed reasonable, so I took his case. At the hearing it came out that they were never a couple, that he was sending sex toys to her residence on a weekly basis, and that she never asked for the thousands of dollars he gave her over the years. Stripper. We lost. He got laughed out of court and he learned a valuable lesson. Tell your lawyer the good and the bad stuff before trial. Now, when my boyfriend and I first started dating, he got hit with a settlement offer. The accusing party alleged that one of his employees caused a data breach within their company and they were willing to settle for $10 million in damages. His lawyers questioned his employee and found that there wasn't anything the employee could have done. The data breach had already happened by the time he got there. So my boyfriend and his lawyers do what any sensible person would and fought it. Several weeks go by and things seem to be going in my boyfriend's favor. Then it came out that the employee had lied to get out of trouble. He didn't cause the data breach, but he made it much worse when he tried to fix it. When the accusing party found out about it, they came back with another settlement. This one worth something like 80 million. They wanted my boyfriend to sell off all unnecessary assets, dissolve the corporation this particular business was under, and give 10% of all revenue from his brick and mortar co to them for the next 10 years. There was nothing my boyfriend could really do to fight it, so the next couple months was an exercise in delaying grief as he sold off everything and handed the proceeds to this other business. The shitty thing is, most of his personal wealth was in his business accounts. He didn't pay himself, he just took what he needed out of the business account and called it his income. He reinvested a lot of his own money into the corporation, and now it's gone. If that kid hadn't lied, he and everyone else would still have their jobs. My boyfriend would still have his corporation and insane wealth. But I didn't get with him for his money. I got with him because he's silly and awesome and makes me laugh all day. He lives with me now. Seems like the sort of traumatic event for which you'd look into counseling. Don't let it ruin y'all's relationship long term. Not my story, but happened to one of my sisters from a couple years ago. A little backstory. My sister had a daughter in college with this guy from our reservation. Our family didn't like him because he came from a notoriously bad family and thought she deserved better than him. She was working and going to school full time while he sat around and sold weed. Big contributor to the household. Anyways, after they have the baby, he starts to want to spend more time with his son from a previous relationship. I guess it's so the kids know each other. The issue with this is that he didn't have her income, so my sister pays for the trips with her scholarship returns. It's a burden, but she finds a way without asking us for help. One day she runs away from home with their daughter. It comes out that their 3 to 4 year relationship was one of domestic/drug abuse and manipulation. Looking back at it now, it's easy to see the signs, but it came as a surprise at the time. The next weeks are full of us moving her out of the house and extreme baby daddy bullshit. They go to court to settle this out. He lost custody of his other child and didn't want to lose custody again. My sister didn't want her or their kid to be involved with him ever again. We kept wondering how he lost custody previously. Was it the result of his drug abuse, lack of financial stability? My sister is granted temporary full custody, and there's another court meeting to establish visitation for him. Not what she wanted, but she was hopeful that she would find a way to have full custody. She goes into their court meet and he's late. At first it's nothing out of the ordinary. Eventually he shows up, and you could smell the alcohol on his breath. He gets in an argument with the judge because he thought the meet was about establishing custody, not visitations, and ends up throwing a chair at the judge. The guards tackled and restrain him. They run his name, and it turns out that he has a couple warrants, so he gets arrested. Sister gets full custody, and we've never seen or heard anything about him since this. My favorite part about his blow up in court is that in the previous meet, he had told the judge that he didn't have any problems with alcohol or his anger. Had a guy at work who had a brain aneurysm and survived it and developed what can only be described as split personality. He was warned by ours almost a dozen times for swearing at staff, sending personal texts of abuse, but they couldn't do anything because he could claim work stress caused it, which is most likely true. Lawyers got involved after a while because it was getting out of hand. People were crying in the office demanding he got taken away from them, threatening to not come in until he was gone as they didn't feel safe around him. He then sent an email from his own personal address to a colleague's company email address saying he couldn't believe she betrayed him after all this time and didn't back him up, knowing his condition. They'd been good friends quite a few years and she did support him at work, and he should have slept with her back in the day as she's clearly such a slut, and he knows where she lives, so maybe he'll pop round one night and make it happen, even if she didn't want it. The lawyers took one look after she handed that email in and went, "Yeah, you can fire him now." He was gone within about 48 hours. Employment case. We got to the deposition of my client and all set up. The first question is, please state your name. The client looks at me and says, "Can we take a break?" We do, and she pulls me out in the hall to tell me she's lied to me about her identity. She's apparently a serial fraudster and has changed identities 7 times since the 90s. She apparently thought the other returners had somehow figured it out, and that's why they asked the question. Story from my dad, who, at the time, was a detective. Guy breaks into a store and steals money and some stuff. The guy's lawyer talks to my dad before the trial, says they'll be pleading not guilty. Paraphrased. My dad, not guilty? Lawyer, yes, he has an alibi. My dad, did he mention to you that we have CCTV footage of him breaking in and committing the crime? Lawyer. My dad. Lawyer, yeah, we'll be pleading guilty. Not a lawyer, but was a union rep for a while. Guy was dismissed for failing a drug test. He seemed to think the union was a magical entity that could somehow help him. I was also a union rep for a bit. This is a very common belief. Union sounds a lot like job insurance to some people. I know, and it's not even my stories but my dad's. He was working as a fraud investigator for an insurance company. I have a few stories of his, but here's two of them. Guy was claiming theft of multiple items, but mainly a ring. Things weren't adding up, so my dad and the insurance company's lawyer decided to do a depot of him. Guy shows up and is doing the depot when my dad notices the guy is wearing the exact ring he's claiming was stolen. My dad slides a note to the lawyer telling him the guy's wearing the ring. Once the note got slid, the guy realized what happened and put his hands under the table and took the ring off. They asked him to stand up, and lo and behold the ring fell to the ground. Another one is a guy claiming a break-in and theft. Immediately things weren't adding up as the window was broken out instead of in. The guy submitted Polaroids of items he claimed were his, like TVs and such. Thing is, in the Polaroids you could see the reflection of the store they were in on the glass. He also claimed numerous CDs/records, but oddly enough every single one started with an R, S, or a T. We are talking hundreds of CDs/records. My dad was about to deny the claim in person, but noticed he had a gun on the table, so decided to do it over the phone. Ready for an escalation? Later this same guy was arrested for beheading a prostitute and throwing her head in the river. I wish Michael Cohen or Roger Stones or Farmer Bro lawyer respond to this post with juicy and crazy details. I was about to complete a land transaction which required my client to have built a road. Indeed, the entire point of the transfer was the road. My client, as I call him prior to completion, turns out didn't build the road. I was in court once as a visitor. Man did an artsy greeting to the judge. His mom was right behind him. Not his proudest moment, I believe. Did you mean it as, hey, I'm an artsy, deal with it, or as this trial is a violation of my rights? I feel like I'm living in Nazi Germany. Either way, not a smart move. Not a lawyer, but my mum, also not a lawyer, told me about a story where she sued a woman my mum babysat for. The woman had a boy, around 6 years, and she needed a babysitter while she was working. My mum took the opportunity to make some extra money, but after around 4 months the woman stopped paying. So after half a year my mum sued, and in the courtroom the woman apparently said something along the lines of, I didn't pay her because my son was sleeping all the time. I know it. So not only did she not pay my mum, but it came out that she had some guy stalking my mum not only while babysitting, but also after and before that, so the woman would know what my mum was doing. Isn't the whole point of a babysitter to make sure the kid goes to bed on time and isn't alone in an empty house? Estate matter. Client neglected to tell me he had 4 children from a previous marriage. Guess who showed up to challenge the will after he died? They lost, but I would have drafted his will differently had I known. I'm late to this, but I'll share mine anyway. TL. Doctor, client forged the bank statements that her entire wrongful foreclosure case was based on. We had clients who said the bank wrongly foreclosed on their house. The wife provided bank statements their checking account was in a different bank than their mortgage, showing that they had made their payments every single month for the past several years. I checked through each one to make sure they all showed payments and looked good. There was also proof that the notice of foreclosure was never actually delivered to them. The bank was baffled. Expert witnesses we talked with confirmed that during the recession, a lot of banks' record keeping had gone to shit, and a wrongful foreclosure could definitely result from that. We got to mediation, and the first thing the bank comes back with was that upon close examination, they had noticed one tiny error on the bank statements, so they were calling off mediation and subpoenaing statements from the bank itself to check against our client's statements. Our clients were pissed, and so were we. So what if the bank had made a tiny error? The opposing side got the subpoenaed statements a couple weeks later and sent them to us, and I had the joy of comparing them. I quickly noticed that there were differences between the ones from our clients and the subpoenaed ones in the electronic withdrawals section. Our client had used a PDF editor to delete an entry in that section on every statement, add the mortgage payment, and then adjust the totals, carrying them over each month. We approached our clients about it, and we said these look forged. We can drop the case or you can explain what the issue is. The wife said we should probably drop the case. She never confessed to us about forging them, but without a doubt, she had forged them. Her husband had no idea. He actually wasn't on the call where we accused her of the forgery, and he called a few weeks later asking for a case update. That was not fun, telling him his wife had lied to him for the last year and a half. The opposing side said they'd be okay with us dropping the case, as long as our clients paid their attorney fees. Our clients were happy to do that. It's actually very lucky the defendant bank didn't try to get them charged criminally. Probably when I was set for trial on a DUI, the day of trial I get a call from the state attorney that it was never disclosed in evidence that the friend my client had been meeting the time of the arrest was a meth dealer, and it was believed my client was in the middle of trying to buy meth. When I confronted him about it, he just looked at me and said I didn't think it was important. It wasn't alcohol. Florida DUIs are alcohol or any controlled substance. Thankfully, kept that out of trial due to late disclosure. Still lost cause he's an idiot. Not a lawyer but a paralegal. I work personal injury and focus motor vehicle accidents. Had a client who had an accident in March. She had quite a medical history, so we were prepared for the causation fight. Now the attorney on this particular case was already super over this client because of how consistently she called the ambulance and went to the ER. Checking into the ER and NC can start at $1,100 depending on the place, but even the crappier ERs are roughly that, just to check in. So comes time clients completed treatment and it's time to obtain medical evidence to fight the at-fault defendant insurance company. Finally get M's records in, and we summarize them prior to sending to the insurance company. Come to find out, she was in a second accident in May, just 2 months after the original. The most detrimental thing was that she had the exact same injuries as the first accident. So here we are with about a year's worth of treatment and the insurance company only considered 2 months of it. Also, out of the 8 times she called M's, the record stated that only 2 of them were legit. The other 6, the EMTs wrote that there was no issue when they arrived, or something very similar to that. It turned into an absolute shit show, and client's whole thing was that she didn't see it as an ISA since she was already getting treatment. Mind you, we call these people every few weeks for this exact reason, and out of all the times I spoke with her, she never felt the need to even run it by me. Not a case we took, but this man contacted my firm wanting us to represent him in a claim against the police. He told us that he had been in a local council office sorting out a problem with his benefits, and the staff had called the police on him saying he was a terrorist, which he said was based purely on his appearance. He then said the police had rushed in and taken him to the floor, injuring him. He said his previous firm had told him to drop the case after getting written advice from counsel, which rang alarm bells, so I asked to see the advice. After reading it, it became very clear why they had told him to drop the case. CCTV had been reviewed, he had been shouting and screaming at the staff and threatening to set himself on fire, then started picking up objects and waving them around. The police had then come bursting in and tackled him. Needless to say, we had to decline to take the case. Damn it, I miss all the good threads. Lawyer, but it was my colleague's client, not mine. I did see this all go down firsthand. Client was on probation for a drug-related offense. Part of probation was that she had to stay clean. She knew this. Also, it's worth contextualizing that she wasn't on something like meth or heroin. She just liked smoking weed. Lawyer tells client multiple times, including a few days before her next hearing date, you will be tested at the courthouse. You gotta be clean for a few days at a minimum. Lady swears up and down she's clean. Hearing date comes. We are sitting around in court. It gets to her turn. The judge asks her point blank, Miss Smith, Are you clean today? Lady, yes, Your Honor. Judge, okay great. The bailiff is going to escort you to go get tested. Sit tight. Q client looking visibly surprised. Regular other stuff continues in the court. Meanwhile, this lady, who is definitely not clean, slips out of the door and all of the way out of the courthouse. The judge is obviously furious when he realizes she ditched them. They catch up with her by that afternoon and now she's not only popping dirty on the test, but the judge is pissed. So he's going to throw the book at her. All she had to do was not smoke weed for a few days. That's it. She was nearly done with her probation. Instead she went to jail. Myself. I'm not a lawyer, but had to deal with 2 years of this. She had heavily abused our nephew, and, after a lot of efforts to help her, Child Services told her they would be removing him. She told the social worker off, called us, said she was done with the whole thing, and wanted us to take him. We said sure. She signed over guardianship and custody in front of a notary. Kid came to live with us. She went her own way. Nearly 3 years later she decides to take us to court to get him back. She also decides to file to completely cut us out of his life. Her entire case is based on the story that she never abused him, Child Services was never involved, and that we had kidnapped our nephew and bribed the notary to forge the documents. Her lawyer believes this story. Her lawyer orders any child welfare records about our nephew/myself to be released to the court. She's confident there's not going to be anything. The judge gets a massive file with a history of child welfare involvement from the time our nephew was 6 months old until they informed her they'd be removing him. He was 6 then. They even documented that she had voluntarily surrendered her parenting rights to us instead. There was stuff in there I had no idea about. Coincidentally myself didn't come to court that day or any of the remaining days and stopped responding to her lawyer. The trial was over the next day. We ended up with a much stronger order and were awarded court costs, including a large portion of our lawyer fees. The judge then also ordered that the court costs all had to be paid before Arsil could file against us in court for anything again. Made our lives so much better in the end and provided a real solid life for our nephew. I was the one being sued for a car accident. I said he ran the red light. He said I did. Went to the deposition and his attorney was asking about his day-to-day activities since the accident. He stated that most days he takes out the trash, watches TV, and smokes crack. Smokes crack. Anyhow, his attorney decided to drop the case for obvious reasons. Never heard another thing about it. Not a lawyer but a prosecutor. The case involved 4 men found with a pound of meth, guns, cannabis, and they all had existing warrants. The very first line of the police report read, "We saw 4 black guys in a car, so we pulled them over." This isn't a place where you can lawfully stop a car just to check its papers. But no, they flat out admitted to racial profiling as the only reason for pulling the car over. Everything was thrown out. Thankfully they all had existing warrants, but it was pretty funny to hear. I've got a friend who had their client leave during recess in court to commit another crime, the same as he was on trial for at the time. Vertical bar, she got called to go see him back at the prison when she'd been expecting to see him back in the courtroom. Fired and wrongly accused of sexually harassing her co-workers at a Christmas party. Turns out she doesn't actually remember the Christmas party because she took an Ambien and was drinking. This doesn't completely apply, however it made me look, or at least feel, foolish. Figured I might as well toss it out, so some joy can be had from it. I was an intern for a public defender between my 3L and 2L year. I was able to practice under a limited license, so long as my supervising attorney was present. This meant I was able to do certain simple things like arraignments to gain experience. One morning we met with this fellow before his arraignment. He told us that he was guilty and didn't want to fight the charge. He just wanted to get some help with his drug problem. My supervisor explained that he would be an excellent candidate for the drug court program, and he explained that the first step in the process would be to plead not guilty that day, so an agreement could be worked up with the prosecutor. I sat and watched as my supervisor explained the whole process to this guy, who seemed to understand completely. He seemed entirely sober at the time and responded adequately to what the attorney was saying. Finally, he asked the guy, would it be okay if my intern represented you for this? It's rather simple. All he'll say is not guilty. The guy agreed, and I was excited. Cut to an hour or so later. I'm seated next to this guy. I enter the plea. Everything is fine. Then the judge asks, "Sir, do you have any questions for the court?" The guy, after having been explained the process thoroughly by advising attorney, says, "Can I just confess now?" All I could hear was the residual ringing of my ears left by a soul leaving one's body. The judge gave me the most pitying look I've ever seen and said, "Sir, I think you need to consult with your counsel." My advising attorney then came up, tapped me on the shoulder, and said he'd handle it. Like a shamed puppy, I scurried back behind the bar. The attorney quickly conferred with the client and the plea went ahead as planned. Later he told me to get used to that, as functional addicts tend to become experts in making people think they understand what they've been told. Edit. Grammar. Clarification. Not a lawyer, but I was in court over a custody dispute with my ex. My ex tried to play victim with crocodile tears which made the judge visibly roll his eyes. She tried arguing with the judge in front of her lawyer. The case was so lopsided that I didn't even have to speak. I had a justice boner 4 months after that one because we were in what was effectively a 2-year constant fight. A prosecutor tried to hide a detail, an actual person that could provide exculpatory evidence on behalf of my client. That former prosecutor is no longer a lawyer anymore. Family friend is the lawyer here, representing someone accused of embezzling $2 million from the company she worked for. The embezzling was discovered through lavish spending, including the accused buying multiple $100K cars for family members, while on a salary of $80K. The case is going okay otherwise, as there are problems with some of the evidence. Defendant decides to hold a press conference and claim she won the money at the casino. Obviously this kind of thing can be checked, so the lawyer asks the client to immediately hold another press conference to say she misspoke. Otherwise she is fucked, because they'll be able to tell she is lying about the source of the money, and lying shows knowledge of wrongdoing. So she holds another press conference and says she misspoke. Except then she adds on to her statement and says it wasn't her who won the money at the casino, but her cousin who won the money at the casino. Lawyer had to drop the client at this point. To make matters worse, the $25K she paid him sat in his escrow account for a while because it was obtained fraudulently. Unsurprisingly, I don't believe he got the total sum in the end and had to go to court, but the public face of the crime was valuable in terms of advertising. The embezzler got fucked pretty hard as tax evasion was also involved, not surprisingly. Union rep, not a lawyer. One of our guys fell and hurt his back and was out on disability for an extended time period. Employer likes to send private eyes to check on people on disability and had video of him pressure washing at church. We go into a meeting with ours and it goes like this. We walk in, him slowly and wincing. We sit. Our guy asks how he injured his back. He proceeds to stand up, say "I'll show you," and throws himself on the floor, then starts writhing in agony. Myself and our guy just looked at each other blankly for the 2 minutes this went on. He fired. Not as dramatic as others here, but it happened yesterday. My girlfriend's parked car was hit a while back. The driver's girlfriend was the owner and insured. She was telling insurance that the driver wasn't authorized to drive the car. This was news to us and explained why insurance and subrogation had taken so long. In a pre-court conference yesterday morning, she finally admitted that she was a passenger in the car, to which our attorney said, "Wait, you were in the car with him? So either he was authorized and you've committed insurance fraud by saying he wasn't, or you were being kidnapped and forgot to tell us. Both are felonies. Which is it?" There was this guy named Jussie S. No, that's too obvious. Let's say J. Smollett. Too many to count. Clients always lie to make themselves look better. They think that the lie will help their case. They think the judge or the prosecutor would believe the lie and the outcome will change. Mainly in my courthouse, the lies revolve around drug use, whether or not they have a drug problem, the reason for stealing and the like. People are hardly honest with themselves about their shortcomings. You cannot expect them to be honest to someone else that they do not know and probably do not trust. I would wager that the reason you're getting no responses is that lawyers aren't generally allowed to share stories like this. If it's done in court, it's said in a public forum. Pretty sure you can relate something you totally saw someone else's client do. General rule of thumb is no identifying information. Basically, we keep it super vague when talking about cases publicly. It's why some of the stories here may not totally make sense. We are likely not divulging more salient details. As long as there is no identifying information, is it still not allowed? I heard that doctors can share things, as long as it's not personal/identifiable. Late, but here we go. My dad worked for many years as a top dog in hours for the USPS. They had a guy who was on disability 4 years claiming back injury, said he couldn't even stand up straight. Anyways, the postal inspectors got involved and sent him a letter saying he was randomly chosen to win a bunch of exercise equipment. All he had to do was show up at a location and let them film him using the equipment for an overseas ad. Guy shows up and they got him on row machines, Versa climbers, treadmills, you name it. Needless to say, the video was brought into evidence and my dad said you could see the defense lawyer's jaw drop when the video was played. Not a lawyer, but was in court to testify on another case. Accused is pleading guilty and judge tells him to allocute and describe the crime. After the defendant gives a detailed confession, the judge glances at the paperwork and says, "Mr. So-and-so, that's not what you are accused of." The guy groans and says, "Oh, that's the other county." I practiced family law and represented dad going for custody. He had told me that mom has cheated on him with a plethora of men, giving me a list of 15 or 20 names. Names changed obviously at the day of trial during cross-examination of her. I get to the list. Me, you cheated on him with John Smith. Yes. No. Me, you cheated on him with Mike Davis. No. Me, you cheated on him with. I slept with all of those men, but he was right there with me, and I saw the case dissipate immediately. Not a lawyer, but my father is. This would have been back in the 80s in Rhode Island. A longtime friend of my dad calls him for some legal help. So my dad finds that A has gotten in trouble for growing magic mushrooms right next to the state police barracks and trying to sell them and some coke, because sure, why not, exclusively at the nearby bar that was the main state trooper hangout. They just kept buying from him for a while and logging it immediately as evidence, recording everything and using him as a teachable moment for recruits. So, not looking great for A. Trial comes along. A detective gets up to give testimony and A excitedly says, "Dave, what are you doing here?" Fassipum from just about everyone. Still, things go on. A wants to speak in his own defense. His lawyers advise against this, but he takes the stand and says basically, first thing, I would like to inform on the mob. Now, Rhode Island was and remains fairly mobbed up at very high levels. I did have a bunch of useful information on the mob and was promptly moved into witness protection, but according to my father, is probably dead now. TLDR, you can't fix stupid. Client was a decades-long employee with a bank. Came in to dispute a termination for cause. She advised that in an act of desperation, and at a time we had good evidence she was under great mental stress and depression, she had kitted a check depositing a check you know won't clear, then using those funds to withdraw money or write your own check. This was the basis for the termination. It was an arguable case. The client had immediately thereafter quickly ensured there was enough money in the account that the bank suffered no actual loss, and her job had no access to or connection to money, the banks or its clients. It was not for the purposes of pure theft, but more for the purposes of getting access to funds early at a moment she needed them. Partway through discovery, the bank pulled out records and ATM footage that showed our client doing the same thing over 100 times. Case didn't go so well after that. Not a lawyer, but was at court one day clearing up a ticket. There was a guy in front of the judge who only spoke Spanish and had an interpreter. Judge said, "So I see here that you're all here for having 3 driving on suspended license tickets?" Guy says, "See." Interpreter, "Yes, your honor." Judge, "So Mr. So-and-so, how did you get to court today?" Guy says something in Spanish. Interpreter, "Your honor, he drove here." Judge, "Sir, you're going to jail today, and we're impounding your car." Judge was pissed. She said more than that, but that's all I can remember. It was years ago. It was pretty funny. I'm a lawyer, and am fairly late to the game here, so this may get buried. This was less of an omission, and more of misremembrance. I had a DUI client who the police had dead to rights. She was driving home drunk the morning after St. Patrick's Day, or maybe it was her birthday. Can't 100% remember. Head-on hit a car of senior citizens on their way to church. It wasn't direct head-on as she was still able to drive away, but the senior citizen's car was damaged. Well, someone saw the accident and followed her to her house and called it in. Additionally, there were drag marks from the accident to her house from a piece of her car that was damaged and dragging on the road. My client had gone into the house after parking the car in the garage, and minutes later the police knock on her door. According to her, the police advised her that they would kick her door in if she didn't answer, which they can't do without a warrant or exigent circumstances which didn't exist here, so as a result she opened the door. She then stated that the African American officer barged past her and went straight to the garage despite her objecting and telling him he couldn't go in there. So fast forward to the day of trial, and I have really not a whole lot to go on from a defense perspective. Clear evidence she was in the accident. Eyewitnesses, all 4 people in the car, and the guy who followed her showed up to court. Officers there, field tests and intarks all properly administered, etc. Literally my only argument is a 4th Amendment violation related to the police coming to her door and threatening her to get the door open and then searching the garage without consent, a warrant or exigency. Again, the whole basis for the assertion that they threatened to kick the door in and that they went straight to the garage despite my client's protests were based on my interviews with my client. Well, when negotiating with the Deputy Attorney General on this case, I bring the issue up. She listens intently, and when I get to the part about the African American officer going to the garage without consent, she looks at me very confused and starts reading through the file. She then calls the other officer in and asks about what happened. He proceeds to tell how drunk my client is and that they asked her to open the door and she did, and they asked to see the car and she said it's in the garage, go ahead. The DAG then asks about the other officer that was with him, and the officer says yeah, he is here, let me grab him. In walks another white police officer. The DAG looks at me and says it appears your client may have a credibility issue here. So I go talk to my client to inform her that there was never any African American officer, and she responds that she was so hammered that she barely remembers the incident. Yeah, we plead to a first offense DUI that day. Posted before, but here goes. This was a good while back when I began as a public defender. TL. Doctor, client was guilty. Twice. Now, as a public defender you don't so much get asked to take cases so much as assigned, but I'm gonna count this one, so I have a chance to tell the story. So when you get assigned to a case, you get a file that generally consists of the police report and any witness statements that may have been taken by the police and /or DA. Because the state has a duty to disclose evidence to the accused's counsel in the states. Anyway, if they know of the existence of video surveillance, generally the DA would stamp in the report KS/WP known surveillance/ will provide. I get a routine destruction of property case where my client is accused of destroying a computer monitor. The officer's account of the case was simply surveillance reviewed. Client taken into custody, stamped with the red KS/WP. Client called and sounded much more reasonable than she would turn out to be. She calmly explained it was a wrong place wrong time issue where she was passing through and tripped to hit the computer at a receptionist's desk. So we schedule an initial meeting for Friday. Friday comes around, and about 10 minutes prior to the client's arrival, a runner from the DA's office delivered the CD with the video. Being a bit busy at the time, I figured I'd watch it with the client when she arrived. She arrives and again, seems just fine. I mention that we have the surveillance and could go ahead and review it, and she pleasantly agrees. Her and her reasonably well-dressed husband come in, joke a bit about how awkward this all is, and sit down across from me. I turn the monitor around so we can watch what happened. In the 5 minutes of surveillance provided, the first 4 minutes were a mundane scene of a receptionist answering phones with a pair of double doors behind her. I fast forward. Then, cue the music. I watched my client kick open a pair of double doors, screaming at whatever was on the other side. She leaves. The comes back in, screaming again, and re-enters the double doors. Then I see security guards gently escorting her out as she is screaming at them. Security stops at the double doors. My client goes over to the reception desk and leans over the counter to, you guessed it, grab the computer monitor, take it over her head, and bring it smashing to the ground. She gives a finger to security and leaves. We watch the next 30 seconds instant silence, and the tape goes black. Now, I knew enough to watch my client's reaction during this, and she was a goddamned statue. Didn't move. Stared at the screen with the smile of someone who has killed before. Probably. She turned to me and said, so, what are you gonna do about this? I didn't know what to say, just kind of stared at her. Well, I'll probably work on a plea deal. Hopefully you pay them, and get a couple of hours. I didn't do it. Well, yes you did. I just watched it. She stands up, and without breaking eye contact, grabs my computer monitor, lifts it up, and smashes it on the ground. She picks up her purse and walks out. Her husband follows, but turns to me in my doorway, and gives me the finger, shaking his head in a for shame kind of way. I did not take the case. When Odge tried to put on the glove, over a pair of rubber gloves he was already wearing. Try that at home sometime. That trial was such a shit show. Excellent way to show why you never let the defense run the circus. Day 2 of a custody trial, where my client was a former alcoholic that had been in AA/rehab for a year. The opposing side played a video from 2 months before the trial where my client encouraged their 7-year-old child to take a shot of Captain Morgan while the client was drinking. The child looked into the camera after finishing and said, "Look client, I drank all of the alcohol." My client laughed on camera and congratulated the child. It wasn't ideal. I have a lot of clients in Saudi Arabia. The way hearings work there is, when a litigation party is a company, their GM will get an automated notification from the court, which they obviously then have to pass on to us, so we can arrange for someone to attend the hearing. One client is very bad about passing the notifications on to us, and we suspect sometimes they withhold them on purpose. Very aggravating. I'm not a lawyer, but I was the one who was sued. My ex hired a lawyer and sued for partial custody of my son. A year prior to this particular suit, my ex was given 2 hours a week of court supervised visitation with my son. He told his new lawyer that nothing has happened during the course of supervised visitation to cause the court to not award periods of unsupervised visitation. Technically, I guess it's true, since my ex had never showed up for a single supervised visit. When this came out in court, his lawyer was visibly pissed off. He asks for continuance and withdrew himself from the case. This guy swore up and down that his income hadn't changed in a support modification. When we finished with discovery, we saw he actually doubled his income through bonuses and neglected to tell the court nor the eyes. Went from trying to keep his support from going up to trying to help him avoid tax fraud charges. Came out in his conference. My boss was totally blindsided. I'm just an assistant and this story may not be properly explained. Not a lawyer, but one I personally witnessed. A guy claims that he can't speak the native language whilst defending himself on a serious assault charge. So the court brings in a translator. Whilst adjourned, the jury and the court officers are outside having a smoke break. Out comes the defendant on his phone, talking without an accent in the native language, saying how he's got the case sewn up because no one can understand him in his native language. Cue looks of disbelief from the officers. A quiet word in the judge's ear in his rooms, and the judge comes storming out, yells for everyone to come back in, and promptly writes a warrant for the defendant for contempt of court. The judge was loud enough that we could hear everything in the chamber on the opposite side of the building. It was not pleasant. Not a lawyer, but a student interning at a law firm. We were doing a child custody case, and the client failed to mention that her current partner has a record for domestic violence. We only found when opposing counsel brought it up. Doesn't help that the client also decided to not show up for her own court date. Another one was one that I witnessed in court. The guy's home was getting foreclosed on by the bank for failing to pay his mortgage. The bank's lawyer basically offered to just let the bank repossess the home and write off the mortgage, even though the home was valued at less than the mortgage. The judge even told the guy that this was the best option. The guy then tries to fight it, saying he's got a sale lined up, and when the judge asked how much he was selling for, the guy said a number that was about $70K short of the mortgage amount. The judge and the bank's counsel were gobsmacked. The judge ended up vetoing the guy's decision and was like, "No sir, you don't understand your situation. If you sell the home your way, you both lose your home and have to pay $70k out of pocket to the bank. I'm making the decision for you. We are doing this the bank's way. Good day." Like and subscribe for good luck, you handsome gentleman.